Welcome to our episode of Bytes with your host, Doug Truitt, Head of Revenue Success at Reynolds United. Say hi,
Hey
Doug.
guys.
And
Howdy.
myself, John D. Relay, Revenue Management Expert at Wheelhouse. And we're going to be having another 20 to 40-minute conversation about revenue and distribution topics in the vacation rental spaces. This is our 9th episode. If you've been following, we really appreciate your time. Today, because we're getting close to the holiday season, we wanted to talk about what we're calling celebration calibration, event and holiday revenue strategies. So let's just talk about what's coming up. So we'll kind of start with the format we've been doing, and we'll just hit on some initial recommendations, and then we'll dig a little deeper into details. So Doug, what are some recommendations about how should people approach holiday, or I also say event, kind of revenue and distribution strategies? What's something important for people to understand?
Yeah, I think this is a good episode, just because we're, like you said, we're getting near to the holidays, but I think, like you just kind of hinted at too, it's really relevant for really any kind of real events that are going on throughout the year and how you're kind of strategizing it. I think there's two parts to events that we got to think of with regards to like the holidays and then outside of the holidays, which is, events that always fall on the same week and weekday or weekend day of the year. And then there's also floating events where they are always on a specific date, which changes on days of the weeks and stuff that everybody got to consider. So with that, my 3 recommendations that I give for you guys all before we kind of get into the meat and potatoes is really number 1, use your historical data for events like Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's. I know that COVID, obviously, historically, it has had a big impact on data and how people look at things, but New Year's, Christmas, and Thanksgiving has not changed as far as the time of year that it's at, and the type of people that usually utilize it, whether it was during COVID or not COVID. Rates may fluctuate, but I think you should really look at things like what worked from a MLOS, or a minimum length of stay setting standpoint, for each of those events, and also maybe converting, or consider inverting, the strategy, utilizing the OTAs and length of stay discounts, meaning don't be so rigid about your minimum length of stay settings you're sending out, which impacts your ability to be seen in search results, but make your rates more desirable at what you want them to be. But then use the OTAs features for promotions to actually put in a length of stay discount. That means that if somebody is looking for that 5 or 6 day length of stay, you give them a 15% discount or something to incentivize that longer length of stay that yields you a little bit more revenue. Second one I have for you would be, really pay attention to the gap nights, because when you do have minimum length of stay settings, even if you have like a 2-night or a 3-night over New Year's or something like that, there is the possibility that you could be creating some gap nights from before that, where somebody's checking out on New Year's Eve day, for example, and it really impacts your ability to sell New Year's Eve on that night. So really pay attention to those event date ranges and watch your pickup heavily on those. Your revenue distribution teams really need to be looking at those where the MLOS settings are, preventing, loan nights from converting, that kind of thing. And then obviously adjust your rates for it too. Lastly, number 3, mine would be is assess your historical channel mix over these holidays to see what avenue consumed, your availability and at what rate or length of stay. This can really help influence, the focus of your time and attention to optimally convert at your desired strategy. And I know we're a little bit late for it because Thanksgiving is next week, but that would be one where I'd say option number 2, really pay attention to those gaps and see if there's anything left that you can actually not leave anything on the table, so to speak. So those are my 3.
Awesome. I would say, when we're thinking about events, whether you're using a revenue management platform or not, events, particularly recurring events, events that in your market that come around every year that seem to be pretty established, I would actually suggest that you utilize your own historical kind of experience over what your platforms recommend, and then use the platforms to guide or influence your decision making at key points. These are going to be key dates for you. You kind of know what people are going to be expecting. It's okay to override a Wheelhouse or Price Labs or one of these other programs with your rates. Now, what I would say is it's important to understand that conditions change, right? Inventory changes. The last couple of years have shown us that things can be very volatile for the holidays. I mean, let's give an example. The key booking window this year might have been earlier in the fall, but we were kind of in a COVID peak. So maybe everything's behind in the booking windows. We don't know if those will snap back or not. So I would say start with your experience where you think things should be, but then use what's being recommended in the system to inform whether or not you need to make changes. So that's the first thing. Kind of counter to that too is keep track of what days you consider to be like key known recurring events. Figure out what you think the optimal booking window is, either based on your historical booking or maybe some market information, and then set reminders for yourself, either on your Google Calendar or something else, to start looking at those times and ask yourself the question, is the market saying I have a chance to do more? Is the market behind? What would I do in those situations? And that's really going to prepare you. I think the holidays this year are really weird because booking windows have been so messed up. So last year, they weren't necessarily as affected by COVID as they were this year. Some people, the market may have been really far behind and they didn't change their strategy, and now they're a lot less occupied than they want. Other people, maybe the market was behind and it snapped back in the short term, so they're doing better. It's very hard to know. So the best thing you can do is just set some benchmarks for when you want to check these. If you know it's 30 days before, if you know it's 60 days before, put those on your calendar so that people on your team know to start looking and paying attention to those date ranges. The kind of next thing I would say in regards to these is kind of similar to Doug's gap night thing. I tend to actually suggest, I prefer that people spike prices instead of putting on longer, like more restrictive length of stays. You can, if your portfolio is really static and things seem pretty stable in your market, it's fine. But I tend to think that it's better to have more eyes on you, and it's better to increase the most compressed night substantially, but open up your availability a little more. One, if conditions are changing, it makes it so you're a little bit more flexible in terms of the amount of people you're marketing to. But if you do that, the thing to keep in mind is that you will potentially create more gap nights. Now, you may be making the same amount of money, but you have an opportunity to sell those nights now. And there's a couple things you can do. One, if you're paying attention to your restrictions, make sure you open those up in a timely fashion. Two, I also suggest if your sales team is also aware that these are key dates and what they should expect, you can also offer those kind of additional nights to those people, especially if you do it pretty close to the time of sale, for a discounted price. So now you can net a much higher revenue overall. And it's very easy for your salesperson on the phone or via an email like the next day or in 2 days to say, hey, we noticed that you're staying 2 nights over this thing. Did you want to add a night on either side for this price? And now you can both increase your occupancy and increase your total revenue for the reservation without having to deal with a bunch of different turns during what otherwise might be a difficult time to schedule turns, right? So those are the big things I think are kind of important.
Awesome. One thing I was going to add, I was thinking about what you were saying there too, is, people need to really consider availability too. If you're trying to prevent any bookings happening on the OTAs because you think you can just get it all, direct, really consider the rate markup strategy. And we've talked about it before on our show. But really don't try to limit the amount of exposure you get during these events and holidays. Just adjust what you're marking up the rates to those OTAs so that you can get the maximum amount of exposure, because a lot of times people will just go and search organically and find you directly anyways, but they may not have found you unless you appeared on the OTAs where they probably are going to see you first. So if they end up winding up on your direct site and find a pleasant surprise of a nice little discount or a cheaper rate, you're gonna still get your bookings and revenue as much as you can without compromising your rate in the short term.
I'm going to give you a disclaimer on that. I really don't think people should mess with their markups unless they can do it by time period, because booking window is really important. And so if your booking window is 60 days, if you do the markups, you're kind of screwing with all the time around it. And maybe your holiday season is spring break. It's very limiting. I would say, yes, you should absolutely control where your distribution is coming from if you have the capability to really mark that up for specific dates on specific channels. If you don't, I would kind of advise that you don't mess with it, because there's unintended consequences of that are hard to anticipate.
Yeah, especially, and that goes back to like what you said, really watching your booking windows too, to understand, because then you'll know what you make decisions on could affect things in the future or in the real short term.
Yeah. So let's jump down to our kind of first question, which is, what are the different kinds of events and how should PMs approach it? And we pulled a quote up It's from Donald Rumsfeld, and I think it applies really well to this this kind of situation. And it's, there are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know, but there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know. It's a great quote. He was talking about a rock or something, but we can talk about it in terms of hospitality. So, Doug, what are your thoughts on that right now?
I think one, I think it's really funny. Just because I told you before, but you just need to add something to the end of it and say, because I imagine everybody reads that quote, and the first time they read it, they're sitting there going like, "Oh, my brain hurts." Like, what? I don't get it. But the reality is that events, even though you know what an event is, and if you know about it, it's still kind of unknown because each year it changes. Those events have different followings. They have different marketing pushes from those events specifically that people are needing to come in and stay for accommodations for. There could be different societal trends that changes on the way that the attendance happens, or what the behavior is, or what people want to do from it, from the I guess the economic standpoint, right? What they're willing to pay, what they're not willing to pay. So don't pretend. I think what I get from that question is, don't pretend that you know everything about that event and what it's going to do. Just be ready and be agile to pivot and move with it, and have your toolkit really defined and really in a place that you can quickly implement different things at a moment's notice. Because when the demand is hot and you're not prepared for it, you could miss out on some valuable conversion and bookings during that time frame.
Yeah, I'd like to define it a little bit, just so people kind of know what we're talking about. I think the known knowns are going to be like these recurring holiday events or time periods that you really solidly know are high for your market. Maybe that's spring break if you're in the South. Maybe that's, Christmas is always the same time every year. You kind of know what you're going to do here. And I would just advise with your known knowns that you use your experience first, and then you use systems or market data to inform what you think any changes to that. I think that's going to be kind of the easiest one for us to deal with. Now, keep in mind, there are some caveats. We do know that there are some events like, Mardi Gras is a good example. It's a known, but it actually moves around every year. New Year's Eve is a little bit like that because we always know it's going to be popular, but it's not always on a weekend. And so you do have to kind of think about how that might affect you, and you may not know the answer, but it's something to consider. You got to be on top of that. Now, your known unknowns are a really interesting one, right? This was actually a thing that we had to deal with at Stay Alfred a lot because we were dealing with urban inventory. And we know on an annualized basis that a certain amount of revenue is going to come from these like high value dates that occur when the market compresses due to conventions, particularly. But when you're researching conventions, you don't know which ones are going to be really popular. And you also don't know when they're going to occur every year. They tend to occur around the same seasons, but it's very variable. And so the way we dealt with that is we didn't try to anticipate exactly what events were going to really make the market move, because we were always wrong. Or we were wrong enough that it evened out too much. We price dates too high and they don't book, and then we miss out on the other dates. So I think what you need to do with those kind of situations is we established a strategy where we would hold the rate higher until a certain point, because if you hold the rate at kind of what that event rate would be, those conventions tend to book a little earlier. So you start booking there, and then you've located those dates, and then you drop the other stuff down to what you'd consider the regular market transient rate. So maybe that time period for us was often about 90 days. Like we would keep the rate, everything at that kind of like holiday rate, and then within 90 days we would drop it back down. You can use controls like minimum price if you have really dynamic minimum pricing rules in your system to be able to do that. If you're setting your rates, obviously you can just manually change them. In addition to that, we would also, if you have any yielding capabilities, whether that's through a system that's using market data, those will start to push those up early so you can see them. That's a little bit more of a reactive approach, which is also good. I still recommend you use some kind of premium outside of your booking window just to keep all dates high. And I also suggest that if you have a lot of these kind of known unknown kind of events, that you keep your minimum length of stay a little higher. further out. So if you know your booking window, your primary booking window is within 90 days, maybe outside of a 90 or 100, even 120, a little after that, you keep the minimum length of stay at like 3, even though you're willing to take 1s in there. Because what you don't want to happen is have a convention start to book, and then now it's all filled with a bunch of 1-night stays, because people do that, right? You probably know your CEO flew into a conference and then didn't stay the whole time. I'm saying that because our CEO just did that. And didn't plan to do that until like the day of the conference. So that's something to like keep in mind, right? I think systems, once we start getting into the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, it's actually really hard to handle these without a revenue management system that's looking at market data. You can do it if your portfolio is large enough, but really, if you're not using a system, you're not going to catch them. So what you do want to do is set in some controls. This is even with a revenue management system. You'd want to set in some controls to keep your rate higher outside your booking window, just to kind of mitigate that risk, particularly if you're on a small portfolio or binary listings. Once we get to our unknown unknowns, those are just like, you know, even in hindsight, you're not really even sure what would have caused it. It could be trends in your own portfolio. Like maybe you had a group that booked a bunch of your units and you raised them. Now you can just command a higher price because you have less to sell and you have so much time to sell it. Maybe there's a bunch of small events going on in the market, nothing that would be really clear to affect you, but it just caused market compression. Or sport events are a good one. Even though we kind of know sports schedules, sports are really difficult to price for because every year different teams are good and they all have different schedules, and you don't always, like, to be perfectly frank, your revenue manager is not often like really into sports, so they may not like be very aware of like who's good or like how to price that. So in those events, I would say you can do a little work ahead of time, particularly with sports schedules, by anticipating them and maybe keeping the price higher. You can definitely implement things like a far future premium, where outside of your booking window, you're just keeping the price higher. Those same kind of length of stay things apply that we were talking about, but I honestly don't think you're going to really capture much revenue without the assistance of a market-based revenue management system, particularly one that's looking at bookings or transactions in the marketplace, because historical data isn't going to tell you these things, right? And so they become very difficult. The way hotels do it is they have really good data on transactions, both in the past and currently. They can make those comparisons. Wheelhouse does use something like that. And I think, you know, as the industry matures, more and more will move that way. But I do think that other than setting up, like keeping your price higher outside of your window, you really do need to be able to use a system to maximize that, because you're just not going to be able to anticipate it.
Yeah, I think one thing I would say, and a lot of you, if you've watched our other episodes, you know, I think in the volatility episode, we talked about really developing kind of like toolkits, and you hear us mention that a little bit from time to time. I think a really good practice here is, you know, almost segmenting, you know, like your kind of like high demand event kind of playbook. It's like, okay, your known knowns, like give some examples and define that for your team so they understand what known knowns are. Give an example of what known unknowns are, right? Maybe it's an event that you know always happens around this time of year, but it fluctuates and moves a little bit on dates, and you're not really sure what that will do to the affecting of the booking windows and that kind of stuff, like John was saying. And then the unknown unknowns, like you don't know, and then something could come out of the middle of nowhere that you discover something that was an unknown unknown. And so it's kind of like, if you have those examples for your teams to understand what those kind of mean or what they are, then also have a matrix that says, boom, here's your step 1, go do this. Step 2, go do this. Step 3, go do this. Kind of create a playbook for yourself, because the reality is that sometimes I know that I felt at Stay Alfred, when an event would pop up out of nowhere, it was kind of like, all right, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? It's like, figure it out. And it was like rallying people. And it's like, it would be nice in those situations if you could kind of somewhat triage the situation just like immediately, and just be able to be like, hey, go grab the book, the proverbial book sitting on the shelf that says, here's the SOP on if it's a known unknown, or known unknown, or unknown unknown. And then that would be a really good strategy to help you and your company in general, just to spread awareness and transparency on how to mitigate situations.
Totally. And it's going to be a little different. Like, scale is a big aspect of this. Interestingly, events are a lot more forgiving when you're at scale, because you can extrapolate demand. When you don't have scale, or you have a very diverse portfolio, it's very difficult to extrapolate demand. And in that case, I would really recommend that, one, you look into a market-based system to give you some information about what's going on around you, but two, also to use some of these strategies, which is identify your booking window and set some rules up so that you mitigate the chance of basically just selling your product out before you're aware that something is occurring. The other end of the coin is that when you're at scale, some things that you were doing when you weren't at scale are no longer going to work. A good example from our Stay Alfred days was, when we were about 100 units or whatever, we had units in a bunch of cities. It was like, Christmas is solid. Like, Christmas is a great time of year. It's super good. Once we started hitting like 20, 30, 50, 100 units, like, that was really hard for us to change in our consciousness. Like, we used to have high restrictions. We used to have high rates. The first Christmas that went by where we actually didn't even sell out, and what we did sell was like at a much lower rate, was like super shocking. Everyone was like, you screwed it up. Turns out, when we had 10 units, we just captured all 10 people who were looking for that product, but not everyone's family is traveling for the holidays, right? And so what we had to do is actually adjust our strategy to accommodate our scale. And what we realized, the way we approached that was actually reducing our restrictions. We use some of the benefits of scale, which is you can start at a lower price point and build it up based on where you are in the booking window. That's a good thing to do. We also spiked the individual compression nights instead of just dropping rates all across the board, or keeping rates high all across the board for like an entire period. And one thing to keep in mind as you grow, and I know a lot of companies are growing right now, is what you're doing on the holidays may not apply. And you do need to review that strategy, particularly if you're really high rate and really restrictive.
Also the property mix too really comes into play when you start, scaling and growing. I mean, I remember, it was a bigger thing, not specifically related to events, but I think we had some really big growing pains at Stay Alfred when our saturation went from more heavy on like 2-bedroom than 3 bedrooms, and it went into studios and 1-bedrooms was more the dominant inventory mix that we had. And I know we had some real big pain points there with regards to conversion and demand, and what we thought we expected should happen based on how we were before, when it was mostly 2 bedrooms and 3 bedrooms, more groups, more families traveling, you could get better prices that way. But when it turned into more studios and 1-bedrooms, it was shorter booking windows, lower rates, less length of stay, that kind of thing. And it really, I think, impacted a lot of, demand events and things like that with regards to like holiday seasons and stuff too. So make sure you're being considerate too about saying, I know my stuff from before, but then if you're scaling and growing and your mix is changing from the type of inventory, you really got to consider that it's a, kind of a unknown territory.
Yeah. So Doug, how do you think people should go about locating these events? I mean, both in all three categories: known unknowns, unknown unknowns, or known unknowns, whatever.
There's some really good stuff out there that, I mean, I'm surprised that some people haven't really, that are clients that I've talked to that didn't know existed. But like, if you have listings on Expedia, I mean, I know that, Expedia is slowing down as far as the vacation rental space because they're not allowing as much onboarding into Expedia for vacation rentals, and they're pushing more people towards Vrbo. But if you do have an Expedia Partner Central login credentials, if you go in there, whatever listing you're on, you can actually look on the Rev Plus section, and they actually have like events they'll show, and they'll show you a calendar, and it's like, be like, oh, Taylor Swift concert or whatever is going on over these dates, and you can actually assess it. And they even have some data in there on some of those events where they actually say estimated attendance of people that are going to those events. So that's a really good one if you have access to it. If you don't, and you're in markets that you really care about, I really highly recommend getting with the local CVB or Convention Visitors Bureau and becoming a member. Some of them are super cheap. They're not very expensive for an annual membership, and you get like extranet credential logins, and you can actually go and look at events on the calendar that city knows is coming into town, both big and small. And then you can also put yourself potentially in the mix to look at RFPs or requests for proposals that the hotels are doing for some of the conferences that are coming to town. So you can actually see what the attendance is, or the attendee estimation is going to be for some of those conferences that are maybe an unknown for you in the vacation rental space, because you don't really mess with the hotel convention life. But at least you would know, hey, there could be some overflow because this one conference is predominantly at 3 hotels, and those 3 hotels combined only have 2,000 rooms, and the attendance is like 20,000 people. So there's going to be an overflow, that they're going to be looking for accommodations elsewhere, and people might find a vacation rental. So those are some areas that I would recommend looking for. Also, some of the data providers out there, like I know Wheelhouse, I'm sure, has some stuff, but also you've got like Price Labs, Beyond Pricing, See Transparent. They even have some stuff in there that kind of shows some things that are happening. You can also do some Google Trend stuff too, where you can set up some alerts for your area, where if something gets announced or something like that, to alert you, and you can kind of dig on that a little bit.
Yeah, the tough part about event lists is you really cannot tell the impact. You know, a good example is we've seen some conventions that are really large at Stay Alfred, but they don't actually affect the rate situation. I mean, you can't tell if a convention is going to be locally attended or not. So when you're thinking about these kind of events, I would approach it from the revenue manager side, which is I would look at your future occupancy by day. You need some level of aggregation to do this. You have to have enough properties to aggregate, and early bookings are always an indicator of something, right? And so if you have these strategies where maybe you're keeping your rate and your restrictions a little higher further out, you want to look at what dates are picking up early, you know, outside of what you would consider to be your booking window. If you see a couple bookings trickle in, those are dates now that you should be paying attention to, particularly if you see more than one. You know, one booking isn't always a trend. Sometimes, you know, you can make it a trend, but you want to take a look at what dates are starting to get sold outside of when you would expect them to. And then on top of that, if you make a decision about that date, you need to set up time to check it, whether that's in a month or 2 months or a quarter. A big risk of trying to do event strategy that'll actually make you do a lot worse on events is to see a booking trend, increase the rate substantially, and then forget about it until 30 days in, realize you haven't made another booking, and now you're potentially selling for cut rate because it was misidentified. So you need to make sure that you set reminders to check these things that you observe. If you are in a small portfolio where you don't have the capability to do this kind of aggregation, I would suggest that you use a revenue management platform, right? Because you need something that's going to react to the market trend for you, and you're not going to be able to figure it out yourself. You might be able to if you're using like a key data or something to see what the market occupancy is on a given day. It's much more difficult. But I would suggest using a revenue management platform. And then whether you're using a revenue management platform or not, I still suggest using FR Future Premium and a little bit higher minimum length of stay further out, just to mitigate those. And then I think there's an important aspect of sometimes you can identify zones, right? Where some of these expectations are. In the urban side, it's like convention season. You know, conventions tend to get booked around the same times in a market every year. It doesn't mean there's not important conventions, but you kind of will learn that. You know, I'm sure in vacation destinations, those high season zones, you know, you can probably attribute to something at spring break, or maybe second, third week of March are always kind of high. And so you can start to think about those. And again, set reminders, know when to start looking at those dates. It's really important. We used to do it on our Google Calendar and include a bunch of people on the team. So if there was turnover or anything, it would come up a year later, you know, 3 months before, and be like, hey, start looking at this in Georgia. And people would be like, oh, this reminder from space told me to do that. Maybe I should ask somebody about it, you know?
Well, I think the interesting parallel to this too is you know, it's essentially A/B testing, right? It's testing a new strategy or a new thought, and it's going, hey, there's a probability here that there could be an event, or could be something that happens, or hey, we're seeing this might be something. So it's like you're testing it out, and you're running a test, and you're running a trial on it with putting that kind of, you know, of a strategy or something in place. And like John, you've said so many times before, like, if you run tests, you got to be watching it like a hawk. You got to be paying attention to it, and at least not letting it go by the wayside, because as we all know from a revenue management perspective, when you're looking at daily pickup all the time, sometimes you can forget about the fact that on this one day you generated something you thought was going to be something 6 months in the future, and you just forget about it. And then all of a sudden you've turned off bookings basically in a demand time frame that might start showing up.
Yeah. And I also think that it's important to, some of this will come over time. And so the benefit of like some of these reminders is transferring information is hard. Like there's an aspect of like feel to revenue management that makes it kind of an art, right? And it also makes it difficult to train and lose people who know it because there's an experiential factor, right? I know, to give you an example, in Spokane, there's a bunch of universities here. And the assumption when you're looking at all of these dates would be, oh, university graduations and university fall family weekends would probably be pretty good. So we should price for all of these accordingly. But what we found is that really only Gonzaga drove rate in the market. Everything else didn't. And that's really hard to tell when you're just doing research. But someone who had worked in that market for a year or so would kind of know that, right? Which is like, hey, we got to be on top of it for Gonzaga graduation, but these other ones we don't. And likewise, it goes to that idea of like, sometimes you can't tell the impact. We have this big event in Spokane called Hoop Fest. It's like the largest 3-on-3 basketball tournament in the country. In the world. It's huge. Like it doubles the population of Spokane for an entire weekend. Despite what you would think, it doesn't drive rate very well. And it's because of a mix of factors that it doesn't drive rate. One, tons of people contract all of this business more than a year in advance. So most of it's already sold. Two, they're contracting rate with the mid-tier hotels primarily as well. And so those people don't always compete with you for like other events and other segments, but they take such a large chunk out of this that they end up competing. And they don't allow the rate to like rise up to these astronomical levels because they're filling all these hotels that your client base may not actually stay in. And then there's also this element of like drive-in and locality. So all of those things together, you would look at this event and be like, this is by far going to be the biggest event in this market, hands down. But you're wrong.
Right. I think what you're isolating too is there's a difference between conversion and increased revenue revenue production out of a certain time frame, right? It might be a very high converting date range, but it doesn't actually yield you any additional revenue. It just converts earlier and faster than it normally would if there wasn't an event during that time frame. But there is sometimes events like Mardi Gras of the world where you could drive the rate up on that thing really high and do really well and get increased revenue as well as, conversion. But like, I know running a hotel in Spokane during the Hoop Fest timeframe, hotels would do strategies like this with certain events where we would block off Hoop Fest for the next year so that no bookings were allowed to even come in 2 weeks before the current Hoop Fest started, meaning nobody could book it a year in advance, 2 weeks before the event started. And we would actually create like a wait list before so that we could actually properly assess what rates we needed to put everything at for the hotel for the next year, because it was just such a high demand thing, but we needed to know what was reasonable for us to put after the event currently finishes in order to make it happen. So there's things like that too, like with what you're saying that the hotels are going to do on certain events in markets and cities, that they may turn off availability so nobody can book anything and create a wait list, or wait till they can figure out a better way to price it out. So you won't know what's actually going to happen in the market.
It's actually a very, very important strategy, particularly in markets where you have like known unknowns. So I'll use the example of New Orleans. New Orleans is a great event market, but for a revenue manager, it's a huge headache because the events are never on the same time, right? And they don't announce them even a year in advance. Sometimes they do. Like that's what's crazy is like you'll have these conventions, they come 2 years in a row, then they go somewhere else for 2 years and they come back for 2 years. So that's super complicated to begin with. Then they also announce it like the day of the last day of the conference. And so you actually want to have your rates out and be available almost more than a year out, but it's hard to price. So you need to think, for these things where you have these important events and you don't always know where they're going to land, you need to think about, hey, do I actually want to sell a year out? Because I maybe need time to make sure I know what these date ranges are going to be in order to set the pricing. Or have I built the infrastructure so that there is some pricing and it's not too low? Maybe that infrastructure is outside of a year. You have the pricing out there, but it's just $1,200 or some exorbitantly high rate. So even if people do book it, you're okay. You know, that's something that you can do. Another thing you can do is just restrict it so that you have time to fix it. One thing we did for an event called Jazz Fest. Jazz Fest is a cool event, drives a lot of rate. It's like 2 whole weekends of like killer music in New Orleans. The problem is they don't like, everyone kind of knows when it's going to be, but they don't officially announce the lineup or the dates until like, you know, 3 to 6 months prior. And that puts you in a tough position as a revenue manager, right? Because you don't know which weekend is going to be the better weekend. And sometimes they actually shift the weeks. So what we would do is we would set the price for like all weekends in the second half of April and the first half of May at the event pricing, like the higher level event pricing. And then we would set reminders to look at what's picking up and just make a decision if we wanted to adjust that. And then also set a reminder for when, basically it was like starting in February, the revenue manager needs to look every week to see if they've announced the lineup so that we can adjust the date periods that aren't having the event down and also make adjustments there. And so building out your processes to handle this unknown is really, really important for you to be able to capitalize on it. And when Stay Alfred figured out how to do it, we became some of the best event rate people in markets, I think. This is definitely shown because Expedia would put out, like when there were Super Bowls, we were super aware of those. And we also knew that our product was really unique for people going to those events. And so we were always the top hotel in terms of RevPAR for those.
I think a good point you're getting at too with the Jazz Fest example is, you know, there are diehard fans of certain events that are like that. And those people, as soon as the announcement comes out, they book. They'll book everything on that day or that you know, within that 2 or 3 days of when that announcement of the dates got released. And then it could dry up and there wouldn't be anything. It might be quiet for a while and then it goes back. So, I mean, it's really important, like in that situation, to know and be alerted when those announcements happen. So you can go make a rate adjustment really quick for those early bookers that maybe just like, hey, I need dates. I don't care about the rate. I'm going to pay whatever and get it. And then you can bring it back down and know there's a lull where maybe it's quiet or something like that. But it's a really, I mean, you can set Google Trends and other things like that too to kind of help alert you with some things potentially. If you know the entity and the URL and the organization that does it, that you could say, hey, anytime this organization does a post, alert me with an email, and then you get it and go and see if they did some kind of announcement on it, and then go adjust accordingly.
Yeah. And a system is going to help a lot with this. I mean, a system is going to do this to a certain regard. I think it's important to remember, though, for events and stuff, the system will help you, but it's aggregating the market too. So if you're really paying attention, you actually have there's usually a lot more opportunity if you're being high touch than what the system is going to. If you're not doing anything, the system is going to help you a ton. A system is also a foundation for you to be able to optimize even further, because the market aggregate's always going to trail the top end potential. That's just the reality of everything, right?
And honestly, the system is always going to be faster than you can actually do it yourself.
Yeah, so it'll give you the indicator, but you can probably optimize it a little more on top of that. It's an interesting problem to have. The event stuff is really complicated. And I think if you're not doing anything, you should use a system. If you do have these processes, you can start to refine them and really, really kind of build in everything you're trying to do.
Yeah, and one small it's kind of a granular detail, but one thing to pay attention to that I was thinking about is in my hotel days here in Spokane, Washington, Washington State is pretty divided with regards to, like, you know, the state, meaning you've got big, huge metropolis over on the west side. And then on the east side, the biggest thing is Spokane, basically. In between, going from Seattle over, that's like the next biggest city is really Spokane. I think maybe Tri-Cities is up there as well. But the reality is, if you start to discover business, in this example for, like, you know, Washington State or in Spokane, and you see an event that's going to be coming to the town or a conference, and it's a government related business, like state government, like John was saying earlier, some of those conferences, you know, every other year they switch locations or whatever. And I would imagine that's a similar behavior in a lot of states where government conferences will rotate between certain cities where they like to do it. And that's to meet the needs of state government employees that don't have to go as far, travel as far. But the big key point to identify with this is that if you do notice something like that or find an event like that, just know that the government business has not really adapted to allowing government employees to be reimbursed or stay with vacation rental style properties. So there isn't a whole lot of like per diem reimbursement type of thing. I mean, there's potential if the rate meets the state government per diem that they could probably get reimbursed or do something with, but there is some barriers there with some of that. So just be aware of that as a false heightened demand if it is government business or a big government conference.
Yeah, Addie's Rentals is actually, and we can tag them when we post this on Facebook.
Yeah.
But I would suggest talking to them. They're doing a lot of work to help us access that business through their channel, and part of that work is the certification requirements in order for people to be reimbursed. What I didn't know that I learned from Anthony is that that per diem, once you're certified, it's a reimbursement, and people can actually spend more if they just pay out of pocket. And that's really interesting, right? Because I'm sure there's tons of people, if they have to travel with family or doing stuff, that are more than willing to pay a little, like if they pay an extra $100 out of pocket, now that's still a cheaper trip for them, but they're able to accommodate what they're comfortable with. But I would recommend talking to them about that per diem stuff. I think there's a lot of interesting things coming as our industry is already kind of much more established than it was 10 years ago. I think it'll be pretty obvious, but there are rules around what you can, you have to have certain things in your place in order to be able to accept that business.
Matteo and Anthony are great guys, very smart, super cool product and channel that they're emerging with. I really like what they're doing.
Yeah. Then I'm going to leave you with kind of one more tidbit, and then Doug, you can leave us with one more tidbit. And then we've been talking at you enough. You got holidays to go to. I'm sure everyone's got a lot of work. But one thing I think is an interesting strategy that's kind of like a marketing revenue strategy that I've heard from folks. People say to me, it's like, hey, we got a lot of return guests. We can't really raise the rate on them, but we know that demand is really strong. I think there's a way to approach that. And the first thing to do is to consider how you can use these kind of really well-known events from a marketing angle. If you figure out your return guests, the people who stayed with you last year and the people who stayed with you maybe over the last 2 years or 3 years, put them together into a marketing list and then raise your rack rate, right? Allow your rack rate to go up, and then just market to those people direct and be like, hey, demand is super high right now. This market is growing. We really value your business. We'll let you book it for the rate you booked it last year, or whatever rate you do. And then you're teaching them that rates are going up in this market. And so that if they don't book, they can expect it and they're not just ridiculous about it. 2, you're getting an opportunity to if you do this 9 months out, you're getting a lot of early bookings from these guests you already know at a rate that you're comfortable getting. 3, you're giving them a timeline. So now if they don't do it, you've built that fire under them. And if they don't do it and they do decide to book later, now that you're preparing them for the fact that the rack rate is going to be higher. You can always make exceptions later if you want to, but I think that that's a good approach where, maybe right after Christmas this year, or maybe you could even do it right before. I mean, that's something for your marketing people to test out. I don't know what people like. They probably are all getting together to talk about it. Maybe you want to send it at the beginning of December and be like, hey, this market's super hot. Rates have been going up. We're happy to do your booking again if you book it this year by the end of December for the next year, whatever. I don't know. Try it out. Maybe try it in February. It's a marketing thing for marketing people to figure out. Yeah. But I do think there's a lot of opportunity there because one, you're increasing your booking window and stabilizing your bookings so that now you can actually do a lot more revenue management on the inventory that's just going to be sold to the general public. 2, you're preparing your return guests for the fact that the market is actually getting more expensive so that you're not just losing out on that all the time. And then 3, it gives you the opportunity to actually raise your rates.
Yeah. I think you're opening up a really interesting opportunity for a lot of things. It may not even be centered around just that event, but maybe you aggregate that whole entire month of a historical data who stayed with you in that month where there is an event, and you broadcast an email to everybody during that time frame and say and push that event that is coming again next year and say, hey, everybody, this event's happening here. You stayed with us this time during this range. would you like to book it at this time? Because it's going to be at this exclusive thing to stimulate your early conversion. And then, like you said, after that, you can go have the rates go up. You don't worry about jeopardizing your brand integrity, but then you're also like you're attracting more people who maybe didn't stay during the event or go to the event last year, but they're like, oh, I didn't know that event was in that town. That place was cool. I'd love to go to that event. And then they book you at, higher rates, and you get better farther out. I think that's a really cool strategy.
Yeah, we'll have to put in the post that we have a really hot tip at the end if they watch.
Yeah. So if they get all the way to the end.
Yeah. Okay, Doug. Well, we've got a joke KPI for you. We've always got joke KPIs. They're the best joke KPIs in the business, possibly the best in the world. Doug, what's our joke KPI today?
Hugely, greatly. That's what they are. We have this week, or this episode, we have rec par. And not rec par as in like a recreation, but like rec as in like wrecking ball. And what this is it's the amount of times a salesperson asks for a waiver to adjust the MLOS or minimum length of stay settings or rates divided by the total working hours of a revenue manager. And specifically, we're talking about mostly like events and all that kind of stuff. I mean, how many times have we had in-house sales? I remember I almost thought about making a metric about number of steps, but I know it's a lot of remote working now. But I remember sales team at the Stay Alfred office, a lot of them just walking over to revenue management or distribution all the time and being like, "Hey, can we change this?" And I'm like, "Man, how much walking are you doing across the building just to come over and ask about this? Because you really want to make that sale."
Yeah. I totally get it. It's like we've spent hours tailoring this rate plan and adjusting it. And like, why even look at it? Just come over and ask us for some low rate.
Yeah.
Like, I get it. I've been on the sales side before too, but
yeah.
It's like, we've had this conversation. No waivers sometimes. Don't ask.
I mean, and I'm not poo-pooing on salespeople, because salespeople, the personality is that they are stubborn and they won't take no for an answer, and they're going to try as hard as they can to make that sale happen. And totally love that aspect. But yeah, it definitely, for a revenue manager, is definitely something that feels like a real drain suck of time.
Sometimes the tactical calculus of the salesperson is that it's easier to beat up your revenue manager than your client.
Yeah. Just stay one more night. Yeah. You'll be fine. It'll be great. Blah, blah, blah. And it's like,
who are you selling to?
Yeah. Who's pay?
Awesome. Well, great joke KPI, Doug. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? I'll tell you a little bit about me, and then we'll get out of here. We'll let you go on your way.
So I'm the head of revenue success for Reynolds United. We're constantly trying to improve the transparency and what we do for our clients to help them do better with regards to channel management, distribution, even some revenue management in there as well. Currently, really proud to, we released our RU Data Studio health cards a couple of months ago. We're actually releasing it tomorrow in a post, so look out for that. But it's an update to it. We actually have listing quality scores on there now. And we also tell you what your unsellable nights are, regarding your block nights, because we hinted at a little bit here in this episode talking about availability, but the thing that is king over everything else with regards to revenue management, distribution, business strategy, anything for the vacation rental space is availability. If you don't have availability, you're not going to get booked. So really keeping a pulse on if you're available or not is kind of our goal with this new release that we're doing, as well as telling you some quality scores similar to what Booking.com and Expedia do. So that's me, that kind of a cool, exciting new feature and product. And turn it over to you, John.
Yeah, that stuff is super cool. I'm really excited. Doug's been doing some great work. And if you're a current Reynolds United customer, you should definitely be reaching out to learn more, because a number of it is already available. My name is John D. Relay. I'm the head of enterprise sales at Wheelhouse. Wheelhouse is a revenue management platform. I said a revenue management platform. We are the revenue management platform. Best UI, doing some great work, pushing additional content out at a super rapid pace. And we're the only team that has published our research so that everyone can see what we're doing in our model, as well as the only team to really have developed a booking-based model that's now powered by with our excellent partnership with Key Data. So if you're really looking to help streamline your revenue management processes, your revenue management systems, or just getting in revenue management and looking to get some better rate recommendations, we're the people to talk to. So feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or via email.
That's awesome. Yeah. And if there's any Reynolds United clients listening, the Wheelhouse, we are fully integrated with Wheelhouse, and you can join up and have them push your rates out to all the OTAs via Reynolds United. Please reach out.
That's awesome stuff. All right. Well, thank you so much, guys. Look forward to next time.
Cheers.